March 15, 1995. Cardinal Alessandro Toretti had been taking confessions from killers for 43 years. Tonight, the killers brought $20 million to confess something different. 4 men in expensive suits sat across from his desk at the Vatican Bank. The lead mafioso, Salvatore Russo, slid a briefcase forward. Inside, bearer bonds that could build 50 orphanages or buy a small country. "Your Eminence," Salvatore said quietly, "we need the Church's blessing on our charitable foundation." Alessandro stared at the money. These weren't donations. They were blood payments from the 'Ndrangheta's heroin empire, the same empire that murdered his brother in 1962. What happened in the next 3 minutes changed Vatican history forever. The FBI had recordings. The Pope held emergency meetings. And for 30 years afterward, whenever people talked about the Church and organized crime, they came back to this night. The night $20 million sat on God's table. The night Cardinal Toretti said 4 words that brought down an empire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. The silence stretched between them like a blade. Alessandro's weathered hands remained folded on his desk, not moving toward the briefcase. Behind Salvatore Russo, 3 shadows in Armani suits waited with the stillness of predators. "The San Giuseppe Foundation," Salvatore continued, his voice carrying the refined accent of a man who'd traded Calabrian dirt for Roman marble. "We want to help the poor children of southern Italy. Surely the Church supports such noble work." Alessandro had heard variations of this speech before. Drug money wrapped in charity ribbons, blood diamonds disguised as wedding gifts. The 'Ndrangheta had been laundering their sins through sacred institutions for decades, but never this boldly, never with this much money sitting naked on consecrated ground. 20 million is substantial, Alessandro said carefully. His fingers found the small recording device taped beneath his desk drawer, a habit 15 years in the making. The FBI would want every word. "Tell me about your foundation's mission." Salvatore's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We've seen too many children suffer, Your Eminence. Street children, orphans, those forgotten by society." He leaned forward slightly. "My organization has resources. The Church has credibility. Together we could save thousands of young souls." Young souls. The phrase twisted in Alessandro's chest like shrapnel. His brother Marco had used those same words before the 'Ndrangheta put 3 bullets in his head for refusing to distribute their heroin through his shipping company. Marco had 5 children then. 5 young souls who watched their father's casket disappear into Calabrian soil. "Your organization," Alessandro repeated. "Remind me of its full name." The man to Salvatore's left shifted uncomfortably. Alessandro caught the movement. Nervous energy in a room where everyone should be playing their part perfectly. These weren't amateurs. The 'Ndrangheta controlled more cocaine than the Colombian cartels. They owned judges, politicians, and half the construction contracts in southern Italy. They didn't make mistakes. So why did he smell fear in this room? "The Russo Family Charitable Trust," Salvatore answered smoothly. "Named after my late father. He always believed in giving back to the community that raised him." Alessandro nodded as if considering this. In reality, he was calculating distances. 4 armed men, 2 exits, the panic button under his desk that would bring Swiss guards in 90 seconds. Too long if they decided charity wasn't enough tonight. "Your father," Alessandro said, "was he a religious man?" "Devoutly Catholic, Your Eminence. He taught me that God watches our every action, judges our every choice." Salvatore's dark eyes never blinked. "He said the only way to wash away old sins is through new grace." The recording device captured every word, but Alessandro wondered if it would matter. The Vatican Bank had been under FBI scrutiny for years. Money laundering, currency violations, connections to organized crime that stretched back to the Banco Ambrosiano scandal. This conversation could be the final nail in institutional coffins that housed centuries of secrets. "And these old sins," Alessandro asked, "what form do they take?" The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Salvatore's companions exchanged glances that spoke a language older than Latin. Alessandro had pushed too hard, too fast, but something about Salvatore's face nagged at him. A familiar angle to the jaw, a particular way the eyes narrowed when concentrating. "Your Eminence," Salvatore said quietly, "some confessions require privacy. Perhaps we could speak alone? The Church values transparency in all its dealings. The Church values survival more." The threat hung between them like incense smoke. Alessandro felt sweat gather beneath his cardinal's robes. 43 years of hearing confessions had taught him to read souls like scripture. These men had killed recently. The calm in their eyes was the peace of those who'd already decided who would live and who would die tonight. "The foundation paperwork," Alessandro said, buying time. "I'll need to review it with our legal department." Salvatore reached into his jacket. Alessandro's hand moved toward the panic button, but Salvatore only withdrew an envelope, placing it beside the briefcase. "Everything you need is there, Your Eminence, including a list of the Foundation's board members. I think you'll find some names familiar." The envelope's weight felt disproportionate to its size. Alessandro opened it with steady hands that betrayed none of his fear. Inside, photographs, banking documents, and a single sheet of papal letterhead containing 3 names that made his blood freeze: Cardinal Bernardo Sant'Angelo, Monsignor Giuseppe Carbone, Father Matteo Torretti. His nephew's name stared back at him from official church documentation he'd never seen before. Matteo, the boy he'd protected from this exact moment for 28 years. The boy who'd joined seminary specifically to escape the family's violent legacy. "The Foundation has excellent church connections," Salvatore said with satisfaction, "including some very close to your heart." Alessandro closed the envelope, his decision crystallizing like ice in holy water. The FBI recordings would have to wait. The Vatican's credibility would have to survive another scandal. Because some prices were too high even for justice. "When do you need an answer?" he asked. Salvatore smiled genuinely for the first time. "Tonight, Your Eminence, before we all leave this room." The $20 million seemed to pulse with malevolent life, waiting for Alessandro to damn himself or his family with 4 simple words. Alessandro's hands trembled as he set the envelope down, the papal letterhead seeming to burn through the thick paper. 40 years of careful distance, of strategic positioning, of building walls between his family and the 'Ndrangheta, all of it crumbling because of 3 typed names. The office felt smaller now, the Renaissance frescoes pressing down like the weight of centuries. He could smell the leather binding of the Aquinas volumes on his bookshelf, the lingering frankincense from morning mass, and underneath it all, the metallic scent of fear. His fear. Theirs. The room reeked of it. "I need a moment to pray," Alessandro said, his voice steadier than he felt. Salvatore gestured magnanimously. "Of course, Your Eminence. We are patient men." "Patient killers," Alessandro corrected silently. He bowed his head, fingers finding the worn silver crucifix at his throat, a gift from his mother on his ordination day. She'd died believing her eldest son had escaped the family curse, that cassocks could shield him from Calabrian vengeance. She'd never known about the recording device, the FBI meetings, the 15 years he'd spent building a case that could topple governments. Behind closed eyes, memories flooded back with devastating clarity. Marco's wedding day, 1952. Alessandro 19 and already committed to seminary, watching his younger brother dance with his new bride in their father's vineyard. Marco's laugh echoing off the Aspromonte mountains, so full of life and hope. Neither of them knowing that the wedding guests included men who would murder Marco 20 years later for the crime of honesty. And the children. Dear God, the children. Alessandro could still see little Matteo at his father's funeral, 8 years old in his only black suit, clutching Alessandro's hand as the dirt hit the casket. The boy had whispered a question that haunted Alessandro's dreams. "Uncle, why did Papa have to die?" "Because your father believed in something," Alessandro had wanted to say. Because he thought goodness could survive in a world built on blood money. Because he was naive enough to believe the church would protect him. But Alessandro had learned better. Over 3 decades as the Vatican's financial guardian, he'd watched holy institutions bend and break under unholy pressure. Cardinals who blessed weapons shipments, bishops who baptized drug money in the name of charity, popes who chose silence over justice because the alternative meant watching Rome burn. The 'Ndrangheta understood this calculus perfectly. They didn't just bring money tonight, they brought leverage wrapped in family bonds. Matteo's name on that foundation board wasn't coincidence. It was a declaration of war disguised as an invitation to dance. "Your Eminence?" Salvatore's voice cut through the silence. Time grows short. Alessandro opened his eyes, focusing on the man's face again. That nagging familiarity struck him harder now. Something in the way Salvatore held his left shoulder slightly higher, a habit Alessandro had noticed in his own mirror for 68 years. The dark eyes, the prominent nose, even the way he unconsciously touched his throat when thinking. Impossible. But the resemblance was undeniable once seen. Toretti features, inherited through generations of Calabrian stubbornness and Roman pride. How many bastard children had their families scattered across southern Italy? How many sins had their fathers buried in unmarked graves? Alessandro's chest tightened with an emotion he couldn't name. Recognition? Fear? Something deeper and more terrible. The weight of choices made in younger years, when survival mattered more than salvation. "The foundation," Alessandro said slowly. "Tell me about its origins. When was it established?" 1955, Salvatore replied without hesitation. "My father wanted to honor my late mother's memory. She died in childbirth, you understand. He never remarried." 1955. The year Alessandro had convinced his pregnant cousin Elena to give her baby to the orphanage in Reggio Calabria. The year he'd arranged for a substantial donation to ensure the child found a good family. The year he'd prayed for forgiveness while signing documents that would erase a young woman's mistake and protect the Toretti name from scandal. The room spun slightly. Alessandro gripped his desk edge, feeling the weight of 39 years of assumed safety crashing down around him. The boy he'd given away to protect the family honor was now a man holding $20 million in drug money, offering it to the uncle who'd abandoned him before his first breath. "Your mother," Alessandro whispered. "What was her maiden name?" Salvatore's eyes narrowed. Behind him, his companions shifted restlessly. The question had broken some unspoken protocol, pierced through layers of careful fiction. "Why do you ask, Your Eminence?" "Because I think I destroyed your life before it began," Alessandro thought. "Because every choice I made to protect my family led us both to this moment. Because God's sense of justice is more twisted than anything the devil could devise." Instead, he said simply, "The church keeps careful records. We like to know our partners' histories." Salvatore studied him for a long moment, and Alessandro saw something flicker behind those familiar dark eyes. Suspicion, calculation, and underneath it all, a pain that looked remarkably like his own. "Toretti," Salvatore said quietly. "Her name was Elena Toretti." The $20 million waited between them, but Alessandro barely saw it now. He was staring at the son he'd never known he had, who'd grown up to become everything he'd tried to prevent. The words hit Alessandro like bullets from his brother's murder. Elena Toretti. His cousin's name spoken by lips that carried her bloodline, her tragedy, and his own 40-year-old sin made flesh. Alessandro's vision blurred momentarily. The ornate office seemed to dissolve around him, replaced by a small apartment in Cosenza, 1954. Elena, barely 18, sobbing into his cassock while rain hammered the windows. "I can't keep it, Alessandro. My father will kill me, kill us both." And Alessandro, 21, and already calculating like the Vatican banker he'd become, whispering promises about good families and fresh starts while drafting the lie that would save their reputation and damn this moment. "Your Eminence?" Salvatore leaned forward, and Alessandro saw Elena's stubborn chin, her defiant eyes that had blazed even through tears. "You seem troubled." Troubled. Alessandro almost laughed at the inadequacy of the word. He was staring at the living consequence of every choice he'd made to protect his family from the 'Ndrangheta, only to discover he'd fed his own blood directly into their machine. The foundation paperwork suddenly made horrific sense. Salvatore hadn't just researched the Vatican's financial systems, he'd researched the Toretti family tree. Elena was... Alessandro's throat felt lined with broken glass. She was family, a distant cousin. Was she? Salvatore's voice carried new weight. a subtle shift that made his companions straighten. "Then you knew her well?" The question hung like a blade over Alessandro's neck. Every word now was a potential confession, each syllable recorded by the FBI device that would damn him to American federal prison. But stopping now meant admitting weakness to men who fed on fear like communion wine. "I knew her," Alessandro said carefully. "She had a difficult life, difficult enough to abandon her child." The accusation sliced through 40 years of careful justification. Alessandro had told himself he'd saved the baby, protected Elena's reputation, preserved the family honor. But sitting across from Salvatore, from his nephew, dear God, the narrative crumbled like ancient parchment. He hadn't saved anyone. He'd simply rearranged the tragedy. "Sometimes," Alessandro whispered, "people make choices they believe are merciful." Merciful. Salvatore repeated the word like a curse. "Is that what you called it when you signed the orphanage papers? When you paid them to bury Elena Toretti's shame along with her son's identity?" The FBI device captured every syllable, but Alessandro no longer cared about federal investigations or Vatican scandals. Salvatore knew. Somehow, impossibly, he'd uncovered the truth buried in church archives and Calabrian gossip. The foundation, the $20 million, Matteo's name on the board, none of it was about money laundering. It was about family justice delivered with compound interest. "How long have you known?" Alessandro asked. Salvatore's smile carried no warmth, only the satisfaction of prey finally recognizing their predator. "I've known Elena's family name since I was old enough to ask questions, but I only connected it to her family 3 months ago when we started researching Vatican financial structures." He gestured to the briefcase. "Amazing what archives you can access with the right motivation." 3 months. Alessandro's mind raced backward through recent decisions, wondering how many times he'd unknowingly played into Salvatore's hands. The FBI meetings, the recorded confessions from other Mafia families, the evidence he'd been gathering to destroy the 'Ndrangheta from within. Had any of it been secret, or had Salvatore been watching him build his own funeral pyre? And Matteo? Alessandro's voice cracked on his nephew's name. "Your brother's boy? He has no idea his foundation board appointment came with such interesting family connections." Salvatore's eyes glittered. "Yet, that conversation depends entirely on tonight's outcome." The threat crystallized with brutal clarity. Alessandro could accept the 20 million, legitimize the 'Ndrangheta's blood money, and watch his life's work for justice die in silence. Or he could refuse and watch Salvatore destroy Matteo with truths the young priest would never survive: that his uncle had abandoned family, that his father's murder connected to Alessandro's choices, that 30 years of devotion had been built on foundations of lies. But underneath the immediate terror, Alessandro felt something else stirring. Recognition deeper than physical resemblance. Salvatore's calculated patience, his methodical approach to leverage and pain. These weren't just 'Ndrangheta tactics. They were Toretti family traits, inherited through bloodlines that transcended adoption papers and criminal organizations. Alessandro had created his own nemesis by trying to save him. "The recording device," Salvatore said quietly, "under your desk drawer. Please place it on the table." Alessandro's hand froze halfway to the hidden switch. 40 years of careful secrets, and Salvatore had known about his most guarded one from the beginning. The FBI case, the evidence, the years of dangerous confession gathering, all of it compromised before tonight's meeting had begun. "You knew," Alessandro breathed. "I know everything, Uncle," Salvatore said, using the family title like a knife. "The only question now is what you're willing to sacrifice to keep it buried." Alessandro's hand remained suspended in the air, fingers trembling inches from the recording device that had been his lifeline for 15 years. The word uncle echoed through the ornate office like a death knell, carrying 40 years of buried guilt and the weight of sins that multiplied across generations. "Don't," he whispered, though whether to himself or to Salvatore he couldn't say. But Salvatore's eyes held no mercy, only the cold satisfaction of a predator who had finally cornered prey that had been running since before his first breath. "The device, Uncle, now." Alessandro's vision blurred as his fingers found the small recorder. The metal felt ice cold against his palm, this tiny machine that contained enough confessions to topple crime families across 3 continents. Hundreds of hours of carefully gathered evidence. Names, dates, bank accounts, murder contracts. The Vatican's secret weapon against the very corruption that now sat across from him, wearing his own family's face. He placed it on the mahogany desk between the briefcase of blood money and the envelope containing Matteo's doom. The soft click of metal against wood sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Excellent. Salvatore reached across and pocketed the device with casual efficiency. You've been quite productive these past 15 years. Agent Martinez sends his regards, by the way. Alessandro's breath caught. Martinez, his FBI contact, the only person who knew about the recordings, the man who'd promised protection, who'd sworn the Vatican's cooperation would remain classified. Another lie in a lifetime built on necessary deceptions. How many people have you compromised? Alessandro asked, his voice barely audible. Everyone who mattered. Salvatore leaned back, suddenly looking younger despite the hardness in his eyes. For a moment, Alessandro glimpsed the abandoned child beneath the criminal mastermind. The boy who'd grown up asking questions about his mother, his family, his place in a world that had rejected him before birth. Did you really think you could wage war against us without consequences? The office walls seemed to press closer. Alessandro could hear his heartbeat thundering in his ears, drowning out the distant sounds of evening prayers echoing through Vatican corridors. Somewhere in those halls, Matteo was probably preparing for Compline, innocent of the family legacy that was about to destroy him. The boy Alessandro had raised in deliberate ignorance of Toretti's sins, believing that priesthood could shield him from blood debts that transcended generations. What do you want? Alessandro whispered. Justice. The word came out like a prayer, but Salvatore's tone made it sound like damnation. 40 years ago, my mother died believing her family had abandoned her. Elena Toretti, 18 years old, bleeding out in a charity hospital while the man who'd promised to help her celebrated his first mass in Rome. Alessandro flinched as if struck. The accusation was unfair. He'd been in seminary when Elena died, hadn't even known about the complications until weeks later. But guilt didn't require accuracy, only proximity to pain. I tried to help her, he said weakly. You tried to hide her. Salvatore's companions had gone statue still, recognizing the shift from business negotiation to personal reckoning, signed papers to erase her shame, paid money to bury her mistake, made sure the Toretti name stayed clean while she bled to death alone. Each word landed like a physical blow. Alessandro gripped his crucifix so tightly the silver edges cut into his palm, drawing blood that felt like penance. Around them, the Renaissance frescoes watched with painted eyes that had witnessed centuries of Vatican secrets, but none quite like this family tragedy playing out in financial terms. The 20 million isn't a bribe, Alessandro realized aloud. It's restitution. Very good, uncle. You always were the smart one in the family. Salvatore gestured to the briefcase. Consider it Elena's inheritance, 40 years overdue. The money she might have used to escape Calabria, to raise her son properly, to live. The mathematical precision of it was breathtaking and terrible. Alessandro could see the calculations behind Salvatore's calm facade, decades of compound interest on a dead woman's dreams, paid in cocaine profits and murder contracts. Justice served at market rates with family discount pricing. And if I refuse? Salvatore's smile returned, carrying Elena's defiance and Alessandro's own strategic patience. Then tomorrow morning, young Father Matteo receives a very interesting package. Photographs of his uncle with known criminals, bank records showing Vatican money in 'Ndrangheta accounts, audio recordings of Cardinal Toretti discussing murder contracts with federal agents. His voice dropped to a whisper. How long do you think his faith would survive that revelation? Alessandro closed his eyes, seeing Matteo's face as clearly as if the young priest stood before him. 28 years old, brilliant, devoted to God with the pure intensity Alessandro had lost decades ago. The boy who still believed goodness could triumph over evil, that justice existed beyond human corruption. Learning the truth wouldn't just destroy Matteo's priesthood, it would shatter his soul. You're asking me to choose between justice and family, Alessandro said. No, uncle. Salvatore leaned forward, and for the first time, Alessandro heard genuine emotion beneath the calculated control. I'm asking you to choose between your family and mine. Alessandro stared at his nephew. The word felt like poison on his tongue, and felt the last pillars of his carefully constructed world crumble into dust. Your family and mine. As if they weren't the same blood, the same cursed lineage that seemed destined to devour itself across generations. You don't understand what you're asking, Alessandro whispered, but even as the words left his lips, he knew they were lies. Salvatore understood perfectly. He'd had 40 years to plan this moment, to calculate every angle of pain and leverage with the precision of a Vatican accountant and the ruthlessness of a Calabrian prince. Salvatore tilted his head, and Alessandro saw Elena again, the way she'd looked when cornered, when all her options had narrowed to impossible choices. Enlighten me, uncle. Tell me what I don't understand about family loyalty. The mockery in that last phrase cut deep. Alessandro's hands shook as he reached for his desk drawer, not for another recording device, but for something far more dangerous. A leather portfolio he'd hidden for 3 decades, sealed with wax that bore the Vatican's private seal, his insurance policy, his confession, his last secret. You want to know about family loyalty? Alessandro's voice cracked as he broke the wax seal with trembling fingers. You want to understand the weight of choices made in darkness? The portfolio opened to reveal documents that could topple more than crime families, birth certificates, adoption papers, and beneath them, a photograph that made Salvatore's composure finally fracture. Elena Toretti at 17, radiant and laughing, standing beside a young seminarian whose face Salvatore had been staring at, across this desk. But it wasn't the only photograph. Beneath Elena's image lay another, a hospital picture of a newborn, taken the day before Alessandro had signed the papers that would erase the child's identity. On the back, in Elena's careful handwriting, "For my son, if he ever asks who loved him first." Salvatore's breath caught audibly. His companions shifted uncomfortably, sensing their leader's sudden vulnerability but not understanding its source. For 40 years, Salvatore had built his identity on abandonment, on the certainty that his mother's family had discarded him like unwanted refuse. The photographs told a different story, one of love constrained by impossible circumstances, of choices made not from cruelty but from terror. She kept these? Salvatore's voice had shed its calculated control, becoming something raw and broken. She gave them to me the night before she delivered. Made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would find you. Make sure you knew. Alessandro's throat closed around words he'd never spoken aloud. Make sure you knew she wanted to keep you. That giving you away was destroying her. The $20 million sat forgotten between them as Salvatore stared at his mother's face. Alessandro watched decades of carefully nurtured hatred war with the evidence of love he'd never suspected existed. In that moment, the criminal mastermind disappeared, replaced by the abandoned child who'd grown up asking questions no one could answer. Then why? The word came out like a sob. Why did you take me from her? Alessandro closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. Because 3 days after you were born, Vincenzo Gallo sent men to Elena's hospital room. They told her that any Toretti child would be raised in the 'Ndrangheta or not at all, that the family debt required blood payment one way or another. Salvatore's face went white. Vincenzo Gallo, his adoptive father, the man who'd raised him, trained him, molded him into the perfect weapon against his own blood family. The philanthropist who'd built schools with drug money and orphanages with murder profits, who'd taught him that love was weakness and family was just another business transaction. He knew, Salvatore breathed. All these years he knew exactly who I was. He knew. Alessandro's voice carried 40 years of self-recrimination, and I gave you to him anyway. I told myself I was saving your life, but the truth is simpler and more damning. I was saving myself, my career, my reputation, my future in the church. The confession hung between them like a judgment. Alessandro had spent decades justifying his choice as mercy, but stripped of its careful rationalizations, the truth was uglier and more human. He'd been 21, terrified and ambitious. Elena's pregnancy threatened everything he'd worked for, and when Gallo offered a solution that would protect both the child and the Toretti name, Alessandro had seized it without considering the cost. Salvatore stood abruptly, his chair scraping against marble that had heard whispered confessions from popes and sinners alike. He walked to the window overlooking St. Peter's Square, where tourists still wandered among ancient stones, oblivious to the family tragedy unfolding above their heads. "Do you know what Vincenzo told me about my mother?" Salvatore's voice was barely audible. That she was a whore who died screaming. That her family paid him to take me because I reminded them of their shame. Alessandro felt something break inside his chest. Each of Gallo's lies had been calculated to ensure Salvatore's loyalty, to guarantee that Elena's son would grow up hating the very family that had sacrificed everything to save him. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty and effectiveness. "Every choice I made was wrong," Alessandro whispered, "but I never stopped loving you, or her." Salvatore turned from the window, and Alessandro saw tears in those familiar dark eyes, the first genuine emotion that hadn't been weaponized or calculated. For one impossible moment, he looked like the nephew Alessandro might have raised, the son Elena might have loved, the man he could have become if choices had been different. "It's too late for love, Uncle," Salvatore said, his voice breaking. "Some damage can't be undone." The silence stretched between them like a chasm 40 years in the making, filled with the weight of Elena's photographs and the ghost of choices that had shaped two lives in darkness. Alessandro stared at his nephew's tears, the first honest thing between them since Salvatore had entered this office with $20 million and a lifetime of calculated hatred. But something in that moment of vulnerability triggered a memory that made Alessandro's blood turn to ice. "Some damage can't be undone." The phrase echoed strangely in the ornate office, and suddenly Alessandro was no longer seeing his broken nephew but remembering another conversation, another voice saying those exact words. 3 months ago, Agent Martinez sitting in a coffee shop near the Pantheon, discussing the Vatican's cooperation with the FBI investigation. "Some damage can't be undone, Cardinal. We have to be surgical about this." Alessandro's breath caught. Martinez had used that precise phrase when explaining why certain 'Ndrangheta operations couldn't be stopped immediately, why they needed to gather more evidence before moving. At the time, Alessandro had assumed it was standard law enforcement pragmatism. Now, hearing those words from Salvatore's lips, the coincidence felt like a death knell. "Where did you learn that phrase?" Alessandro whispered. Salvatore's tears stopped as abruptly as they'd begun, his face shifting back into the controlled mask of a predator who'd revealed more than intended. But for a split second, Alessandro saw something else flicker across his nephew's features. Surprise, perhaps even panic. "What?" Salvatore asked, but his voice carried a new tension. "Some damage can't be undone." Alessandro stood slowly, his mind racing through connections that rewrote everything he thought he understood about this night. "You said it exactly the way he did. Word for word, inflection for inflection." The silence in the room became deafening. Salvatore's two companions exchanged glances, their hands moving subtly toward concealed weapons. But Alessandro was beyond fear now, caught in the terrible momentum of revelation. "Martinez isn't compromised," Alessandro breathed. "He's your handler." Salvatore's composure finally cracked completely, rage replacing calculated control. "You don't know what you're talking about. The FBI recordings. The evidence I've been gathering for 15 years. Alessandro's voice grew stronger as the pieces fell into place. It was never about building a case against the 'Ndrangheta. It was about identifying everyone who might threaten your operations, every informant, every weakness, every potential rival. The photographs of Elena scattered to the floor as Alessandro swept them aside, his movements sharp with newfound clarity. For 15 years, he'd believed he was serving justice, gathering evidence to destroy the crime families that had murdered his brother and corrupted his homeland. Instead, he'd been feeding intelligence to the very organization he sought to destroy, helping them eliminate competition and consolidate power. "How many people died because of my information?" Alessandro demanded. How many rival families? How many potential witnesses? Salvatore said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. Alessandro saw it all now, the careful manipulation spanning decades, the patient cultivation of an asset who believed he was fighting for righteousness. Every confession he'd recorded, every meeting he'd documented, every financial trail he'd mapped had been delivered directly to 'Ndrangheta leadership through FBI channels they'd corrupted from within. The 20 million, Alessandro continued, his voice gaining momentum like a prayer turned accusation. It's not restitution for Elena. It's payment for services rendered. 40 years of intelligence work, delivered through an uncle who thought he was saving his soul. Salvatore's mask slipped entirely, revealing something far more dangerous than criminal ambition. The cold satisfaction of a master strategist whose decades-long game had finally reached its conclusion. Very good, uncle. I wondered how long it would take you to understand. The admission hit Alessandro like a physical blow. Everything. His FBI contacts, his careful gathering of evidence, his belief that he was working toward justice for his murdered brother, all of it had been orchestrated by the nephew he'd tried to save. The boy Elena had died protecting had grown into the architect of his family's complete destruction. Vincenzo Gallo didn't corrupt you, Alessandro whispered, the final piece falling into place. You corrupted him. For the first time since entering the office, Salvatore smiled with genuine warmth. The expression Elena might have loved, twisted into something monstrous by 40 years of careful planning. Poor Uncle Alessandro, still trying to find someone else to blame for your choices. The accusation stung because it carried truth, but underneath the shame, Alessandro felt something else stirring. A fury that had been building for 40 years, fed by every compromise, every rationalization, every moment he'd chosen expedience over righteousness. Salvatore had played him perfectly, used his guilt and his love against him, turned his desire for justice into an instrument of family destruction. But in revealing the scope of his manipulation, Salvatore had made one crucial error. You're right, Alessandro said quietly, his hand moving toward his desk drawer. Not for a recording device this time, but for something far older and more dangerous. Some damage can't be undone, but some debts still require payment. Salvatore's confident smile faltered as he realized his uncle might have one last secret after all. Alessandro's fingers found the worn leather grip of the pistol he'd kept hidden for 30 years. A gift from his murdered brother Franco, given the night before Alessandro had entered seminary. For when prayer isn't enough, Franco had said with the dark humor of a man who already suspected his fate. Uncle, Salvatore warned, but his voice carried uncertainty for the first time. His companions reached inside their jackets, but Alessandro's position behind the desk gave him advantage in the narrow space between Renaissance frescoes and $20 million in bearer bonds. Do you know what this is? Alessandro lifted the weapon, its weight familiar despite decades of disuse. The metal felt cold and certain in his hands, a relic from the man he'd been before choosing God over vengeance. Franco carried it during his last investigation. The one that got him killed by your organization? Salvatore's eyes narrowed as he calculated angles and distances. You're a priest. You won't pull that trigger. Am I? Alessandro's laugh carried no humor, only the bitter recognition of a man who lost his way so completely he could no longer find the path back to grace. After everything you've shown me tonight, what exactly do you think I still am? The question hung in the air like incense burned for the dead. Alessandro had spent 40 years believing in redemption, in the possibility that good choices could balance evil ones, that service to God could wash away the stains of family blood. But Salvatore's revelation had stripped away those comfortable illusions, revealing the truth underneath, that every prayer Alessandro had offered, every mass he'd celebrated, every moment of perceived grace had been built on a foundation of betrayal and manipulation. You gave me to Vincenzo knowing what he was, Alessandro continued, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Knew he would raise me to destroy everything Elena died to protect. My brother, my faith, my soul. All of it was just raw material for your revenge. You gave yourself away, Salvatore corrected, taking a careful step forward. Every choice was yours, uncle. Every compromise, every rationalization, every moment you chose survival over principle. The words struck home because they carried undeniable truth. Alessandro saw the long chain of his decisions stretching back through decades. The night he'd signed adoption papers to hide Elena's shame, the morning he'd accepted his first Vatican position knowing it came with moral flexibility, the afternoon he'd agreed to help the FBI believing he could serve both God and justice simultaneously. "But that's what makes this so beautiful," Salvatore continued, his confidence returning as he read the doubt in his uncle's eyes. "You can't kill me without proving everything Vincenzo taught me about the Toretti family. That we're all cowards who choose expedience over courage, that we dress up our selfishness in pretty words about duty and faith." Alessandro's finger tightened on the trigger, but Salvatore was right. Pulling it would complete his nephew's victory, would prove that 40 years of faith had been nothing more than elaborate self-deception. Elena's son had orchestrated this moment with surgical precision, offering Alessandro a choice between two forms of damnation. "There's a third option," Alessandro said quietly. And something in his tone made Salvatore freeze. "You've spent 40 years destroying our family from the inside, but families have a way of protecting themselves, even from their own children." With his free hand, Alessandro reached for his desk phone, dialing a number he'd memorized but never used. A direct line to Cardinal Secretary of State, the second most powerful man in Vatican City. While it rang, he kept the gun trained on Salvatore, who watched with growing alarm as his uncle chose an option he hadn't anticipated. "Your Eminence," Alessandro said when the line connected. "This is Cardinal Toretti. I need to invoke Article 7 of the Lateran Treaty, immediate sanctuary protection for a Vatican official under direct threat from foreign criminal organizations." Salvatore's face went white as he understood the implications. Article 7 hadn't been used in 50 years, but it remained valid, a treaty provision that granted the Vatican absolute jurisdiction over its territory and personnel, superseding all Italian and international law enforcement cooperation. If Alessandro claimed sanctuary, it would seal Vatican City's borders and suspend all ongoing investigations, including the FBI operation that had taken 15 years to construct. "I'm confessing everything," Alessandro continued into the phone, his eyes never leaving his nephew's face. "My cooperation with federal authorities, my knowledge of ongoing criminal operations, my role in intelligence gathering against Italian organized crime families. All of it ends tonight." The $20 million sat forgotten as Salvatore realized his perfect plan had just collapsed. Without Alessandro's continued cooperation, the FBI pipeline would close. Without the intelligence network they'd spent decades building, the 'Ndrangheta's advantage would evaporate. Most crucially, without Alessandro's silence, the full scope of their operation would become a Vatican confession that could topple governments. "You'll destroy yourself," Salvatore warned. Alessandro smiled for the first time since his nephew had entered the office, and the expression carried all of Elena's defiance transformed into something like peace. "Some debts require everything in payment, nephew, even souls." The word hung between them like a blade finding its mark. "Nephew." Alessandro watched 40 years of careful deception crumble in Salvatore's eyes as the truth he'd fought so desperately to conceal was spoken aloud in the presence of his most trusted lieutenants. "Impossible," one of Salvatore's men breathed, his weapon wavering as he processed the implications. They'd followed their leader into what they believed was a simple negotiation with a corrupt cardinal, not a family reunion that rewrote everything they understood about their organization's most successful operation. But Salvatore's face confirmed what Alessandro's voice had declared. The mask of cold calculation finally fell away completely, revealing not the criminal mastermind who'd orchestrated decades of manipulation, but the abandoned child who'd built an empire on the foundation of family betrayal. His carefully controlled composure shattered like glass against marble. "You don't get to call me that," Salvatore snarled, lunging forward despite the gun still trained on his chest. "Not after what you did, not after what you chose." Alessandro didn't flinch as his nephew's hands slammed against the desk, scattering Elena's photographs across the $20 million that had started this confrontation. Up close, he could see every line of suffering carved into features that mirrored his murdered brother's face. could recognize the same proud fury that had driven Elena to protect her child even as it killed her. "You're right," Alessandro said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated decades. "I forfeited that right the night I signed the papers, but Elena never did, and she would have wanted you to know the truth before this ends." "Don't," Salvatore warned, but his voice cracked like a boy's. "Don't you dare speak of her now." "She named you Benedetto," Alessandro continued remorselessly. "Bless, because even dying, even knowing what we'd cost her, she believed you would find a way to choose grace over vengeance. She was wrong about that, but she loved you enough to hope anyway." The name hit Salvatore like a physical blow. For 40 years he'd been Salvatore, the saved one, the child rescued from family shame by Vincenzo Gallo's false mercy. But before that, for 3 precious days before Alessandro's cowardice had destroyed everything, he'd been Benedetto Torretti, Elena's son, Franco's nephew, part of something larger than criminal ambition. "She died believing you would be better than us," Alessandro pressed on, lowering the gun as he recognized that words would wound deeper than bullets. "Better than me, better than the choices that destroyed our family. She died hoping her son would break the cycle instead of perfecting it." Salvatore's hands trembled as he straightened, his face cycling through emotions he'd spent decades suppressing. Alessandro saw the moment when grief transformed back into rage, when the abandoned child disappeared behind the criminal mastermind who'd learned to weaponize pain. "And what about you?" Salvatore demanded. "What did you hope for while you fed information to my enemies for 15 years? While you played righteous crusader with blood money and told yourself you were serving justice?" The accusation found its mark because Alessandro had no defense. Every choice he'd made after Elena's death had been contaminated by guilt and self-serving rationalization. He'd convinced himself that cooperation with law enforcement was penance, that bringing down the 'Ndrangheta would somehow balance the scales of cosmic justice. Instead, he'd simply become another asset in his nephew's war against their own family legacy. "I hoped for forgiveness," Alessandro admitted. "From God, from Franco's memory, from the child I gave away. I was wrong about that too." The confession hung between them like a prayer offered too late for salvation. Through the office windows, dawn was beginning to break over Vatican City, painting the ancient stones in shades of rose and gold that had witnessed centuries of human frailty. Soon the morning bells would ring, calling the faithful to worship, while a family's destruction played out in shadows. "There is no forgiveness," Salvatore said with terrible finality. "Not for what you did, not for what I've become. Elena died for nothing, and 40 years later her son and her brother-in-law are pointing guns at each other in God's house. If there's justice in that, it's not the kind any prayer can reach." Alessandro nodded, recognizing truth when he heard it. But as he looked at his nephew's face, Elena's eyes and Franco's features, twisted by 4 decades of carefully cultivated hatred, he felt something shift inside his chest. Not redemption, which was beyond either of them now, but something simpler and more immediate. Choice. The same terrible, inevitable choice that had brought them to this moment. "You're right," Alessandro said, raising the gun again. But this time, he turned it toward his own temple. "Some debts can only be paid in full. Resolution." "No." The word tore from Salvatore's throat with a desperation that surprised them both. His hand shot out, not to stop Alessandro's finger on the trigger, but to grasp his uncle's wrist with the strength of a drowning man reaching for salvation. "Not like this," Salvatore whispered, and Alessandro saw something he'd thought lost forever. Elena's capacity for mercy bleeding through 40 years of cultivated hatred. "Not when she's finally here with us." The gun trembled between them, neither man strong enough to claim it completely. Through the windows, the morning bells of Vatican City began their ancient song, calling the faithful to prayer while 2 broken souls wrestled with the weight of accumulated choices. The $20 million lay forgotten, scattered beneath photographs of a woman who died believing love could conquer the darkness that consumed her family. "She wouldn't want this ending," Salvatore continued, his voice breaking like a child's. "For all my hatred, all my planning, I remember her hands, Uncle. The way she held me those 3 days before you gave me away. She wouldn't want us to finish what her death started. Alessandro felt the truth of it settle in his chest like a prayer finally answered. Elena had died protecting life, not demanding more death. She'd named her son Benedetto, blessed, because she'd believed in the possibility of grace even in their family's darkest hour. To end their story with blood would be to make her sacrifice meaningless, to prove that love had no power against the machinery of vengeance. Slowly, carefully, Alessandro lowered the weapon. Salvatore's grip on his wrist gentled but didn't release, as if he were afraid his uncle might change his mind. "What happens now?" Alessandro asked, and his voice carried the exhaustion of a man who'd finally stopped running from his choices. Salvatore looked around the office, at his silent companions who'd witnessed secrets that could topple governments, at the evidence of operations spanning decades, at the blood money that had brought them together in this moment of terrible recognition. When he spoke again, his voice carried Elena's pragmatic wisdom transformed by years of criminal calculation. "The bonds go back to Vincenzo Gailo with a message," Salvatore said slowly, working through possibilities, like a chess master seeing 20 moves ahead. "The Vatican Bank will no longer launder 'Ndrangheta funds. Your cooperation with federal authorities ends tonight, and I disappear before my organization learns that their most successful operative has been compromised by family sentiment." Alessandro heard the unspoken truth beneath the words. Salvatore would have to abandon everything he'd built, the empire he'd constructed on their family's ruins. Starting over would be dangerous, perhaps impossible for a man who knew too many secrets, but it was also the closest thing to justice their family could claim. "And the FBI recordings?" Alessandro asked. "Destroyed," Salvatore said firmly. "All of them. Let the 'Ndrangheta think their intelligence network simply went dark. Let federal authorities wonder why their most valuable assets suddenly stopped producing results. Some mysteries serve everyone better than answers." Alessandro nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in Salvatore's strategy. The boy Elena had named Benedetto was still there, buried beneath decades of careful corruption but capable of choosing mercy over vengeance when it mattered most. Not redemption, that was beyond either of them, but something simpler and more precious, the possibility of ending their family's cycle of destruction. "Will I see you again?" Alessandro asked, though he already knew the answer. Salvatore smiled sadly, and for a moment Alessandro glimpsed the child Elena had died protecting. "You've been recording confessions for 40 years, Uncle. Consider this my last one. I loved her enough to remember what she wanted, even when hatred felt stronger than hope." He released Alessandro's wrist and stepped back, transforming once again into the criminal mastermind who'd orchestrated their confrontation. But the mask no longer fit perfectly. Elena's influence had cracked it beyond repair. "Forgive me," Alessandro said as his nephew gathered the scattered bonds, preparing to leave his uncle's life as abruptly as he'd entered it. "Forgiveness is for priests and saints," Salvatore replied, pausing at the office door. "I'm just Elena's son, trying to honor the only good thing our family ever produced." He left without looking back, taking his men and their dangerous knowledge into Vatican City's ancient shadows. Alessandro remained alone with dawn breaking over marble and stone, holding his brother's gun and contemplating the wreckage of 4 decades worth of choices. The morning bells continued their eternal song, calling the faithful to worship, while a family story finally found something like peace. Not the happy ending Alessandro had prayed for, but the only honest conclusion their choices had earned, a recognition that love could still triumph over hatred, even when it came too late for salvation. Elena's photographs lay scattered across his desk like prayers offered for the dead, her smile unchanged by time or tragedy. Alessandro gathered them carefully, whispering the name she'd chosen for her son, Benedetto, and understanding at last that grace sometimes wore the face of terrible mercy.